Hello, early modern philosophy students. I'm ready for another online class meeting. Today, I will go on to talk about section 8 of Hume's Enquiry concerning human understanding, where he talks about freedom of the will and necessitation, or shall we say, freedom of the will and causal determinism. And he puts forward a certain view in defense of freedom of the will and moral responsibility. And he also talks about determinism and necessitation regarding human behavior. Before I get there, though, I want to go back to sections 5 and 7 that I had you guys study for Friday. And I've received some interesting comments. I can't address, as you guys know, I can't address all students' comments on sections 5 and 7, but I will address some of your comments. And I'll do that before moving on to section 8 of Hume's Enquiry. Keep in mind for this Wednesday, you guys should read section 10 of Hume's Enquiry, which is devoted to his discussion of the phenomenon of miracles and his thoughts on the possibility of miracles and the rationality of belief in miracles. Hopefully you guys will find that interesting. It's a very famous writing on miracles. And Group A, I will want you guys to write something about Hume Section 8 for Wednesday as well. Those will be due early in the morning on Wednesday. So without further ado, let's look at some of the commentaries I got regarding Hume section 5 and 7. What have we got here? Let me go to my computer here. I've got something here from Luke Vanderschaft that I want to respond to. Vanderschaft points out that according to David Hume, we get the idea of necessary connection from the feeling of mental compulsion to expect an event Y to occur after the occurrence of another event X. And we expect, when we get this mental compulsion, when we've seen something happen over and over, when we've seen events constantly conjoined in the past, it's been constantly conjoined. I've got a spoon today, not a pen. But when we see events constantly conjoined in our past experience, I've seen objects released into the air and they're falling, object released into the air and it's falling. I've seen this over and over again. The constant conjunction between the releasing of the object and its falling, or being pinched and feeling pain, putting my hand into the fire and feeling pain. Right? Well, when we experience events constantly conjoined like that, then when we see the one event X, our mind, according to Hume, is compelled to expect the latter event Y to occur, and this is the source of our idea of there being a necessary connection or a causal relation between events. And Luke Vanderschaft expresses some skepticism about this. Vanderschaft writes, and I quote from Vanderschaft at length, he writes, Hume's view is flawed because it is too subject to the above criticism. Just because we repeatedly experience the compulsion of our mind to accept the necessary causal relationship between events that we experience several times over does not mean that in the future our mind will continue to compel us to do the same under identical conditions. Therefore, we are not observing a necessary relationship between two things. We are merely observing an event occur over and over, a cause and effect with no necessitated relationship. In this case, the cause, or perhaps I should say, in this case, the reason for this is observing an event X followed by another event Y over and over again. And the effect is our mind compelling us to expect that when X occurs, Y will follow. There's not an obvious causal relationship presented here because we can still call into doubt the future resembling the past. It is entirely feasible that I will observe an event X cause an event Y, a million times, and my mind does not compel me to associate them in a necessitated causal relationship. Therefore, Hume's answer is no more compelling than the one Hume has dismissed. So what's going on here? I take Van der Schaaf to be suggesting something like this, right? So I've experienced over and over again, I put my hand in the flame, ow, pain. I put my hand in the pain, ow, flame. And according to Hume, having experienced that constant conjunction over time, my mind feels compelled to expect pain as I see my hand approaching the flame. And Hume says that's the source of our idea of necessary connection, that feeling of compulsion in the mind to expect the latter event to occur after the experience of the former. And here Luc van der Schaaf, again, he says, and I quote again, he says, "It is entirely feasible," says van der Schaaf, "that I will observe an event X, hand and fire, cause event Y, pain, a million times, and my mind does not compel me to associate them in a necessitated causal relationship," says van der Schaaf. Let me just say, I think Hume's just going to resist this. Hume's going to say, "Oh, but your mind does compel you to expect the pain when your hand approaches the flame after you've experienced the constant conjunction between hand approaching flame and pain, hand approaching pain and flame, hand approaching pain, flame, and then feeling pain." After you've experienced that constant conjunction, Hume's view is that if you've got a normal, healthy human mind, you're going to feel compelled to expect the pain as your hand approaches it. That's just how the mind works, according to Hume. And so, this is what I think Hume's going to say about this. But of course, maybe van der Schaaf's point runs somewhat deeper here. Now that I think about it, maybe what van der Schaaf is getting at is maybe, and Luke, I don't know, maybe you should write to me about this to discuss it further. But maybe van der Schaaf's point is that Hume can't really, maybe van der Schaaf wants to say Hume can't really justify the claim that human minds are always going to operate in this way. Maybe what van der Schaaf is suggesting is that Hume can't really rationally justify his assumption that that human minds are going to continue to operate and feel this compulsion into the future. So maybe what van der Schaaf is suggesting is that Hume, in giving his count of how we get the idea of necessary connection, maybe Hume is unwarrantedly assuming that our minds will continue to operate in such a way that we've had that feeling of compulsion upon the experience of constantly conjoined events. And so, that may be, if that's van der Schaaf's point, it's an interesting one, and maybe my initial response to van der Schaaf doesn't pay due service to his point. Van der Schaaf, maybe you should write to me about this. I've tried to suggest a response on behalf of Hume, but maybe van der Schaaf, maybe I've misinterpreted van der Schaaf. So Luke, write to me or call me and let's talk about this further. Let's move on. Let's consider somebody else here. Let's take a look at, I've got some things by Selfridge and Molly Walker that I respond to. Molly Walker writes the following. Walker writes, "According to David Hume, the correct view on the source of our ideas of necessary connection originates in the feeling of compulsion in our thinking. Hume explains that when we see events as being constantly conjoined in our experience, our minds then feel compelled to expect one thing to happen after because of it. How can Hume claim this to be the correct view on our source of an idea of necessary connection if this theory is based on the unjustified assumption that the future will always resemble the past? Since the claim the future will always resemble the past is not definitionally true, the only way to know this claim to be true is through empirical evidence about the future. But we don't have empirical evidence about the future, which leads us to assume the future will resemble the past without any evidence. But how then do we know we can trust our feelings of compulsions in our thinking to believe that in any given instance our future will resemble our past if we don't have any evidence and it is just based on a feeling? Well, Molly Walker raises an interesting point here. If I'm to speak on Hume's behalf, I think I would say that Hume's point is that there's no rational basis for our belief that the future will resemble the past, and our beliefs in causal necessary connections between events, right? Like touching the fire and feeling pain. There's no rational justification for our belief that there's a necessary connection between the touching of fire and feeling pain. But Hume's whole point is that we all believe in these necessary connections anyway. Molly, you make this point that, right? You make this point that how can Hume claim this to be a correct view on our source of an idea of necessary connection if this theory is based on the unjustified assumption that the future will always resemble the past? Well, Hume's not trying to give a rationally justified explanation of our belief in cause and effect, because he doesn't think that he can give a rationally justified account of our beliefs concerning cause and effect. Our beliefs concerning cause and effect, they lack a rational justification. Hume's whole point is that we go ahead and we form these beliefs in necessary connections and causation between events, but this is just something that's done on instinct, and we do it based on instinct because our minds feel compelled to expect one event to follow another when we've seen the one event constantly conjoined with the occurrence of the other event in our past experience. Is it rational for us to do this? No. Do we do it and do it all the time? Yes. And so, that's what I would say in giving a Humean response to what Molly Walker's talking about here. Let's take a look at Selfridge. Lindsay Selfridge. Selfridge focuses on certain points in Section 5 of Hume's Enquiry. Regarding Section 5, Selfridge writes, she writes the following: while Hume says that reason is more susceptible to error than, say, instinct, Selfridge questions whether or not this can stand the test of time. As we grow older, we do rely on instinct as justification for matters of fact, but that may not be the only thing we rely on regarding matters of fact and the formation of beliefs about matters of fact. Selfridge says, consider a scientist, for example, attempting to create a vaccine for COVID-19. The ingredients required must be created and mixed in new ways in order to make humans immune to the virus. So I wonder whether those innovators rely solely on instinct throughout their entire lives. I would think and hope that reason is also relied on in order to determine whether or not they can believe in their attempts as matters of fact. While we instinctively form beliefs from the early stages of life, our beliefs sometimes also need reason and understanding in order to trust new combinations of ingredients that must be injected to prevent a new virus strain. Furthermore, in order to think that we can be immune to COVID-19, we might have to use reason and understanding rather than instinct due to its novel characteristic. I find it difficult to believe that innovators and inventors of essential things such as vaccines and healthcare necessities always and solely use instinct in order to encourage trust by the public in their abilities to cure modern and new diseases. We humans must adapt to trust in new innovations based on reason and understanding. Yeah, I find this interesting. And so Lindsay Selfridge is suggesting that informing our beliefs concerning matters of fact, informing our beliefs in the sciences, it cannot be that we're just relying on instinctual cause and effect reasoning. There must be something more involved. We have to be able to make adjustments to what we accept based on instinct. Um, Let me just say something here. I Here's what I want to say. I think, Lindsay, I think Hume may agree that we do use a kind of reasoning to correct what we instinctively believe based on the experience of constantly conjoined events. For instance, we may initially come to believe that two events are necessarily connected because we have always seen them conjoined together. But then we might remember that our personal experience is limited and we might withhold judgment until getting further evidence and testing for whether there are anomalous cases. Right? And then, just thinking about this, for instance, and I think Hume might agree, Lindsay, with what you're saying at some level. I think Hume will probably endorse using reason to correct and refine our thinking about matters of fact. But maybe what Hume wants to say is that still at its core, at the most fundamental level, all of our thinking on matters of fact is based on causal thinking, and that causal thinking is grounded on instinct. But then Hume might want to say, while at its core, all of our beliefs of matters of fact are based on causal thinking. This is not to exclude some role of reasoning as a corrective to help lead us to the truth concerning matters of fact. I have in mind here, for instance, suppose I've never seen a balloon that's filled with helium. I've only seen balloons filled with the air from people blowing up balloons. And, people who blow up balloons with their own mouths, those balloons always fall to the ground ultimately, right? And so, since I've experienced a constant conjunction of balloons being filled with air and they're falling, I may be led to believe that all balloons will fall to the ground when left unsupported. Right? But then when I experience helium balloons, I have to correct, right? I have to correct that judgment that I've made in the past. I have to correct my causal claim that balloons left in the air will come to the ground. I have to correct that once I've got the new experience of helium-filled balloons, right? And that correction might involve a kind of reasoning, right? And I think Hume would be sympathetic with that. In fact, also, if I've never seen the helium-filled balloons, and if I've seen lots of balloons, blown up, by people blowing into the balloons, and I see that those sorts of balloons always fall, and given that I know I have limited experience with balloons, I might even be hesitant to conclude that all balloons fall when left in the air. And I might be hesitant to conclude that because I might recognize that I have but a limited experience of these. So I think Hume would admit that, we might want to use, and many people do use, indeed scientists use reason as a corrective for their observations and their experience of constantly conjoined events that they've experienced in the past. But still, I think Hume's going to say, at some sort of more fundamental and basic level, all of our beliefs concerning matters of fact are based on causal thinking. And at its core, causal thinking lacks rational justification, but it's an instinctive thing that we do. And again, Hume might want to say reason could still be used as a corrective, right, to what we want to believe instinctively. And so I guess I think, Lindsay, that what you're saying here might be somehow rendered consistent with Hume's basic point about our knowledge concerning matters of fact. But that's what I would want to say. I will leave off on this. I hope this has been helpful to you all. If any of you wants to discuss some of this further, feel free to give me a call. I think you should all have my phone number at this point. Let's move on and talk about Hume's thoughts regarding free will and causal necessitation or determination in human behavior. Let's go to the outline. Hopefully, again, you can watch my video in one window while having the outline up in another window. But let's talk about Section 8. Hume says the reason for the long-standing debate about free will and determinism, or the debate about free will and necessitation, and whether or not human beings have the free will that makes us morally responsible for our actions, he believes that this debate is based on confusion about the meanings of the terms cause or necessity on the one hand and freedom on the other hand. Hume believes that a proper analysis of the meanings of these terms, cause, necessity, freedom, he believes a proper analysis of these terms will bring a resolution to the debate on whether or not we have free will and whether free will is compatible with universal necessitation. Hume believes that all human actions, including decisions, he believes that they are all caused or necessitated. His reasoning can be captured as follows. 1. All that we can reasonably mean by saying that X causes Y is that X's have always been found to be constantly conjoined with Y's in the past. Hume says we experience constant conjunctions between certain human motives or character traits and certain human behaviors. Therefore, human behaviors are caused. They are necessitated. Regarding that first premise, all that we can reasonably mean by saying X causes Y is that X's have been found to be constantly conjoined by Y's in the past. I added in my notes here something about page 365 and 366. And I think those points, maybe I won't quote here, but I think those points are developed there at 365 and 366. And Hume says, point 2, we experience constant conjunctions between certain human motives or character traits and certain human behaviors. 366. Hume writes, page 366, about 10 lines from the bottom, he says, all mankind have ever agreed in the doctrine of necessity, and they have hitherto disputed merely for not understanding each other. In other words, Hume thinks that we all actually believe that human behaviors are necessitated by certain sorts of motives. Hume goes on page 366, he states, the same motives always produce the same actions. The same events follow from the same causes. Ambition, avarice, self-love, vanity, friendship, generosity, public spirit. These passions, mixed in various degrees and distributed through society, have been from the beginning of the world and still are the source of all the actions and enterprises which have ever been observed among mankind. Right? Right? Being angry causes certain sorts of behaviors, like the banging of tables, the yelling, the punching, or whatever, right? The feeling of love causes the writing of love letters, the providing of kisses, the giving of hugs, right? Um, Hume says, right, jealousy leads to behaviors that we associate with jealousy, etc., right? We experience constant conjunctions between having certain motives like anger and jealousy and love and engaging in certain sorts of behaviors. We see this all the time, right? And if we see constant conjunctions between having certain sorts of feelings or motives and engaging in certain sorts of behaviors, then we've got, right, then we're going to think that there's a causal connection, a necessary connection between having certain sorts of motives or desires and intentions and certain sorts of behaviors. Um, and we see these constant conjunctions between the forming of certain intentions and engaging in certain behaviors, having of certain motives and the engaging in certain kinds of behaviors. And so stands to reason that human behaviors are causally necessitated by mental states. Hume goes on to contend that in living our lives, we all exhibit an acceptance of this conclusion that human behavior is causally necessitated by certain desires or intentions. Right? For instance, we are willing to make contracts, to make agreements with people whom we perceive to be of reliable character because we believe that their reliable character will lead them to honor the agreement. If I know somebody to be a liar and a cheat, I'm not going to make agreements with that person because I can't trust them to follow up on the agreement, right? But if you show me somebody who is reliable and honest, I am willing to make the agreement, right? And when I'm willing to make that agreement, I'm putting faith in the fact that due to his character, he will be led to honor the agreement. Right? Hume also contends that it is commonly known that there are constant conjunctions between certain A, character traits and motives, and B, certain actions, such that we are justified in supposing that when a behavior is witnessed and we don't know the motive, there must nonetheless be a causing or necessitating motive present. Right? Hume says this, page 370, this sort of point gets made. Oh, I don't have it marked, so I won't quote from that. I don't have it marked. So anyway, look, do we see constant conjunctions between the presence of certain intentions or motives and certain behavior traits following from those intentions or motives? Do we see those constant conjunctions around us? Somebody's angry, so he lashes out. Somebody feels love, so he gives the hug. Yeah, we do see this. Somebody is honest, so he keeps his agreements, or so he tells the truth. We see this, right? And so we have reason to believe that there are causal relationships between the presence of certain, right, and necessitating relationships between the presence of certain motives and intentions and certain human behaviors, right? So Hume believes that he's got the view that human behaviors, they are necessitated by our mental states. But Hume also believes, even though our actions are causally determined or necessitated by our mental states, he also believes in human freedom. Hume believes that even though all of our actions are caused or necessitated by character or motives or intentions, they are nonetheless free-willed. His argument runs like this, and I'm drawing on matter that occurs at page 376 of our text. Hume basically argues that freedom is a power of acting or not acting according to the determinations of the will. This power belongs to everyone who is not a prisoner or in chains. Therefore, some human beings have free will. The idea here, what I think Hume is really driving at here is the idea here is that a person acts with free will when he does as he wants to do. If I am sitting in my chair because that is what I want to do, then I act freely. And this is true even if my wanting to sit in the chair causally necessitates my sitting in it. Therefore, my action can be both free and necessitated at the same time. So if I sit in this chair because I want to sit in this chair, and even if that want necessitates my sitting in the chair, that's a free-willed act, because to act freely is just to be able to act on one's will, to act upon one's desires. And my sitting in this chair, it might be necessitated by that desire, but it would still be free will, because what it is to act freely is just to act in accord with your desires, your will. Now, if I'm in the chair, not because I want to be in it, and if instead someone has nailed the chair to the floor and tied me into the chair, then I am not in the chair of my own free will. You see? Suppose what I want to do is to be walking the neighborhood right now, but my children have nailed my chair to the floor and tied me into the chair. In that case, I'm not in the chair of my own free will, because I'm in the chair contrary to my desire, right? And my being in the chair would not be free-willed, right? But even if, now, in the situation where my chair is not nailed down and I'm not tied into it, but I'm in the chair because I want to be in the chair, and even if that want necessitates my sitting in the chair, that's free-willed, because in that case, my being in the chair is an expression of my will, which makes my sitting in the chair free. Hume here is a classic compatibilist about determinism or causal necessitation and freedom of the will. The compatibilist about free will believes that human free will is consistent with causal necessitation of human actions. Therefore, Hume is a compatibilist about free will. Right? Make of this what you will. Now, Hume, in the latter parts of his section 8 on liberty and necessity, he goes on to develop some possible criticisms of his view, and he responds to them. I always distinguish between what I see here as a moral criticism of his view and a religious criticism. The moral criticism I've got outlined on the handout, the outline. Moral criticism goes like this. Somebody might say, look, we correctly praise people for their virtuous actions and blame them for their bad actions. If all human actions are causally necessitated, as David Hume maintains, then it is incorrect to praise and blame people. So it's false that all human actions are causally necessitated. So the criticism goes. Hume would argue that the second premise of this argument is false. Right? Again, the second premise says, if all human actions are causally necessitated, then it is incorrect to praise and blame people. Hume thinks that's false. Hume says that, in fact, praise or blame are only fitting for behavior when those behaviors are caused by either a virtuous or a vicious motive. For instance, suppose I hit Luke Vanderschaff in the head because I have the vicious desire to see him in pain. Suppose my vicious desire to see Luke in pain causes me to hit him in the head. In that situation, I deserve blame for what I've done. Because insofar as my hitting him in the head is the consequence of my vicious intent, it reflects poorly on me, and it's something for which I deserve blame. If in contrast I'm standing beside Laura Nide and I have a sudden spastic fit that leads me to tremble and I hit Laura Nide in the head, well, then I don't deserve blame, because there my hitting of her is not caused by a vicious or nasty motive on my part. You see, it's just a result of a muscular spasm that I couldn't predict, right? So in point of fact, proper blame for behavior is actually contingent on the behavior being necessitated by contemptible or blamable motives, such as the vicious desire to intentionally cause pain in others. You see what I'm getting at here? So Hume actually thinks that justified blame requires that human actions be necessitated by the appropriate sorts of motives to merit and deserve the blame. So the moral criticism Hume believes is misguided for the reasons I'm giving. Now, there is also a religious criticism that could be made of Hume's view. And I've got that outlined here. Hume says that all events that occur in the world, and that is his view. Hume, let's back up here. Hume believes that all events that occur in the universe are causally necessitated by prior states and events in accordance with the laws of nature. Hume believes all events, including human actions, are necessitated by earlier events. But if there is a God, then this means that God is responsible for all that we do. If this is true, then either A, all we do is good, or B, God's not a perfect being. God's not all good. The critic will continue saying, but neither A nor B are correct. It's not true that all we do is good, and it's not true that God's imperfect. Therefore, Hume's view must be mistaken. Hume's view conflicts with the reality that not everything we do is good. It also conflicts with the reality that God's not all good. Just for a second, on Hume's belief in universal necessitation. If you look at page 365 of this chapter, Liberty and Necessity, Hume says, I hope, therefore, to make it appear that all men have ever agreed in the doctrine of both necessity and of liberty. Right? And page 379 to 380, Hume writes, I pretend not to have obviated or removed all objections to this theory with regard to necessity and liberty. I can foresee other objections derived from topics which have not here been treated of. It may be said, for instance, that if voluntary operations, or if voluntary actions be subjected to the same laws of necessity with the operations of matter, there is a continued chain of necessary causes, preordained and predetermined, reaching from the original cause of all, God, to every single volition of every human creature. No contingency anywhere in the universe, no indifference, no liberty. While we act, we are at the same time acted upon. The ultimate author of all our volitions is the creator of the world, who first bestowed motion on this immense machine and placed all beings in that particular position, whence every subsequent event by an inevitable necessity must result. Human actions, therefore, either can have no moral turpitude at all, as proceeding from so good a cause, namely God, or if they have any turpitude, they must involve our Creator in the same guilt, while he is acknowledged to be their ultimate cause and author, right? That's the argument that I've tried to capture here. So anyway, so what is Hume's reply to this sort of argument? Hume admits that by the logic of this criticism, if God exists, then God is responsible for the things we do. Right? That is, if God sets the universe in motion, brings the universe into existence, and if every event that transpires in the universe, including human actions and decisions, if every event that transpires in the universe is a product of necessitation through causal law, and if God set those laws into place and set the universe into place, well, then God is responsible for the things that we do. if I form the malicious intent to cause Luke Vanderschaft pain and that causes me to smack Luke in the head, well, that intent would have been causally determined by some prior neural process, which would have been in my brain, which would have been caused by some prior neural process prior to that in my brain, and so on, going back in time. And there would have been, presumably, there would have been environmental and genetic factors leading me to have those neural states. And if God set the universe up such that things would unfold in this way, then on Hume's view, God would be responsible for the things we do. Hume also contends that it is utterly implausible to think that everything human beings do is good. He thinks that's utterly implausible. So if there is a creator God, such a God simply cannot be a perfect creator. Hume notes that to reject his view on free will and determinism simply because it does not fit with traditional religious beliefs is not a rationally respectable basis for rejecting his view. I think in the end, Hume's going to look at this religious criticism of his belief in the compatibility of causal determinism and free will. I think he's going to look at this religious criticism and he's going to say, well, it's ridiculous to think that everything human beings do is good. Surely human beings do some very awful things from time to time. And then he's going to look at the claim that, well, if God exists, God would have set the whole universe into motion. And if determinism's true, God would have known what's going to transpire in the future if God's all-knowing. And Hume's just going to look at this and say, well, given that universal determinism is true, and given that human beings sometimes do awful things to one another, and given that God could have foreseen these awful things that we do, Hume's going to say this just gives us reason to think that there's not a perfect creator. And so that's going to be Hume's response to the religious criticism. And so both this moral criticism and the religious criticism of Hume's compatibilism, Hume thinks that they're both misplaced. Now, is Hume's compatibilism a reasonable view about the nature of free will and determinism? Many contemporary philosophers think that it is reasonable. As a lot of you know, I don't. But that's another story, and maybe we can talk about that some next time. I don't have more for you. I hope this has been somewhat informative. Read your section 10 on miracles for next time. I think we're at now Group A. I think Group A, you're going to need to write something about Hume's views on free will and necessity, liberty and necessity. For Wednesday, in Wednesday's lecture, I'll talk about some of the replies to Hume's views on liberty and necessity, and I'll move on to what Hume has to say about miracles. Have a good day. Bye-bye.